All right, good evening, everybody. Come on in. We're going to give you a 2-minute warning. We've got coffee, cookies in the back. If you didn't already grab those, here's your chance. 2-minute warning. Come on through. Someone was asking for some note-taking paper. Pastor Mike has got you covered. He's got note-taking paper. I'm going to pray in 2 minutes, so I'm glad you all are here. Come on down. We'll get started right at 6, right now in 1 minute. All right, guys. Good evening. Welcome to our Family Life Weekend extended session. If you were in the room this morning and looking for an update, our brand new Minister to Students and Families was affirmed by 98.4%. So praise God for that. We're really excited about that. You should be getting that in your midweek email. If you heard David this morning, you know that he's got a heart and a passion that people would know Christ, use technology for the right reasons, and avoid some of the dangers. I just want to let you know, the heart behind your ministry team is to not only do an annual conference for families. By the way, I'm looking around the room, I see tons of families represented. Thank you guys for coming out. That's a big deal. I see some grandparents represented too. Thank you guys. But our heart was, we don't just want to have an annual family conference. We want to have these little moments throughout the year for equipping. Tonight, obviously, is on a specific topic, biblical worldview, technology. We've invited tons of people from our community. The intent was to be a blessing so that families could get equipped. We really are passionate at First Baptist Wimberley to equip Christ-centered homes. And so for that reason, I'm so excited to welcome you. David, come on up. Y'all give him a good old friendly round of applause, and we'll get going.
Well, I just want to say again, I have thoroughly enjoyed the time that I've spent here in Wimberley, and this church has gone above and beyond in showing us hospitality and making us feel welcome. So I just want to thank you all for that and the part that you've played in that. I also want to tell you and give you a heads up that during this talk, my son Keegan's going to be over here taking some photos and videos, so he will have a phone out, and I know he feels weird doing that while I'm talking about not using phones, so I told him I would tell you all that he's going to be doing that so he doesn't feel as weird about doing that. But I want to start off today. Today is a continuation of what we talked about this morning. So this morning, we really spent time, again, building that biblical foundation to understand that God calls us, again, to live in a culture, but then to look at that culture and determine how we live as wise followers of Jesus and not just get in that current and go along and do what everybody else does. And there are some impacts to that in our lives, and we're going to be talking about that tonight. But before we push in and we start talking specifically about technology, I want to really start off with a couple questions. So the first thing that I really want us to take a look at is I want us to, and I'm going to kind of push through here, is I want us to ask this question: what do we want for our children? So for those of you that actually are going to go through the Digital Parenting Fundamentals course, this will be a part of what you do in week 1. But I want you to sit here and think for a minute. Have you ever had a chance to sit down with your spouse? So if you're both here, or maybe the other one had to be somewhere else tonight, but if you've never had a chance to sit down and answer that question, I would encourage you to do that. And I'm going to explain why in a minute. But I'm going to walk through and I'm going to give you the answer that my wife and I had when we were going through and trying to answer this question. And this was something that we looked at long before I ever started going around and talking about this topic. So first of all, with our kids, I had said there are 5 things that I want my kids to have. First, I want them to have a growing relationship with God. So that's number 1. Second is if they choose to marry, I want them to have a strong marriage, not just an adequate marriage, but a strong marriage. Now, for the third one is I wanted them to have deep personal relationships with their friends. Like I wanted them to have a strong group, not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a large group, but I wanted them to have other believers that came alongside them in life and helped them and encouraged them. Deep friendships, not surface level friendships. Next, I wanted them to understand the value and purpose of work. They weren't just out there saying, oh, gotta go to work, gotta do this, gotta do that, all this stuff. No, I really want them to do something that they think adds value to our society, adds value to people in their community, something that actually is something they can wake up each day and say, oh man, I'm doing something good. And finally, I wanted them to be content. Not always be looking for like the next great thing or, oh, if I just had this, I'd be happy. Now, we talked about this long before, like I said earlier, long before I started going around and talking about this concept of technology. But here's the interesting thing. When I started looking at the reality of technology, really examining studies, which is what I spend a lot of my time doing, and I really started pushing into the data, I began to realize that today's technology puts all of these wants at risk. Now, we're not going to have a chance to explain all 5 of the items I have and how technology can put some of those at risk. But here's what I want you to understand. Your first step in addressing this isn't going through and saying, oh, let's figure out screen time, or let's go and think about social media, or going through all of these other steps. Your first step is saying, what do I want for my children? What do I want? What does God want for my children? And then, if you learn about parts of technology, and you determine that technology puts some of those things at risk, then you choose to be proactive in addressing it. Because here's the thing. Here's the reality of it. Like most of us, if we're not careful, we just go day to day as parents, or again, or as grandparents, or whatever role you're in, we just get into survival mode, right? It's okay, let's get the kids to school, then let's get them to soccer practice, then let's get them to swim, let's get them to this, let's get them to that, and then you get home at the end of the day and you're like, oh, we totally forgot about homework, let's get homework done, and then immediately you need to go to bed so that you can wake up and do it again the next day. And if you're in that kind of, if you have that kind of perspective, what ends up happening is you don't ever really intentionally address technology. You just let technology happen to your family. And that's when it can begin to put some of these wants at risk. So, just to kind of revisit a little bit about what we talked about this morning, how should Christian parents, how should Christian families approach technology? Now, as I mentioned this morning, I don't think God calls us to totally abandon all aspects of technology and to simply, live as people that are completely removed from the technical world. I don't think that's what God calls us to. But I do think he calls us to be wise. And ultimately, I think that as a parent, the answers to those questions of what do you want for your children, like those answers, which we call your parenting blueprint, that should be what dictates the decisions that you make for your family. Because one of the things, and you'll hear me say this a lot tonight, if you're a parent or if you're a grandparent, I want you to make decisions about technology. I don't want other people to make those decisions for you. Because I've talked with parents that say, well, my school said my kid had to have this, right? The soccer coach said my kid has to have this app that they can communicate directly with them on. Or whoever else. There's all these people that want to make decisions for us. And my hope is that you will jump in and take ownership of this, and you will not just let technology happen, but you will be intentional. That's one of the 3 aspects that we talk about. So first, ultimately, we believe you should be biblical. We spent a lot of time talking about that this morning. The second is what I just mentioned, is that we should be intentional. Again, we're not just letting it happen, we're making a plan for it. And third, we also talked about this morning, is being countercultural. We're not just countercultural for the sake of being countercultural, but we're being countercultural because we've looked at the world and we've said, listen, there are some things that this current is taking us towards that aren't ultimately going to be helpful for our children. So we're going to choose to address it. Now, as a reminder, one of the scriptures that we didn't read this morning, but it's kind of the Old Testament companion to the passage we did read this morning, says this, and I'm not going to read the whole passage from Deuteronomy chapter 6, but I do want to just talk here about this portion in bold, that talking about God's commandments, it says, you shall teach them diligently to your children. But what I want to remind you of is that this morning we talked about that there is also a link to the culture that we exist in. And so I would add this to that verse, not trying to add to scripture, but just saying, you shall teach them diligently to your children in 2025, right? Meaning that in this culture that we live in, you're called to teach them the commands of God, and you're called to teach them how to live those out in the culture that God has called them to be alive in. Now, we address this in 7 steps. So I'm just going to introduce you to the 7 essential steps of digital parenting. We're going to talk about them briefly, and then I'm going to push into 3 today. Not at a deep level, but just push into 3 of them and talk about some of the dangers. And then my goal is, if you never hear me speak again, if you never get any digitalparenting.com resources, you walk away with some tools that you can use in your home that you can start on immediately to help address some of the dangers that I'm going to talk about. And you can get those totally for free coming out of this session today. So at the very end today, I'll have a link and a QR code that you can use. It'll take you to a part of our website where you will get all of the resources that I talk about, some of the free downloadable resources. You'll get access to those. You can grab those, and you can start working right away. Now, I am thankful, I was talking to Pastor Mike about this earlier, that you all are actually going through the course. So if you really want to walk through each of these steps, then I would encourage you, jump in for those 10 weeks and go through Digital Parenting Fundamentals, and you'll get to analyze each of these at a deep level. Okay, so let's start pushing in here. The 7 essential steps of digital parenting. So we start off here in step 1. We are actually dealing with regulating screen time. That's step 1. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, we know that every digital danger is worse the more screen time you have. So some people think, oh, well, you should deal with, inappropriate content first. But here we really want to get a hold of the amount of time that our kids are in front of a screen and make sure that that's in alignment. Now, this is one of the 3 that we're going to push into tonight. So you'll get to hear a little bit more about this and why this is where we start. But that's step 1. Step 2 is where we're talking about avoiding inappropriate content. So talking about setting digital boundaries while also educating our kids on, again, how they honor God with what they see and with what they hear. And again, in our world, it's far too easy to get to content that certainly is not God-honoring. So what do we do with that as parents? That's step 2. Step 3 is safeguarding mental health. So we had a chance to chat a little bit about that this morning. This is another one of the steps that we're going to push into tonight. So I just touched the surface level with some of the studies. We're going to push more deeply into those tonight just to try to give you a clear picture of the data that we have around mental health. Step 4 is defending against predators. So limiting access to your family while building up awareness. Now, this is the 3rd one that we're going to be pushing into. And while you may have an idea of what you think this one is about, I encourage you to kind of keep an open mind as we get to it, because we're probably going to talk about aspects of this that you're not expecting. Then for step 5, we have respecting yourself and respecting others. So this is really talking to your kids about how they should be treated online and how they should treat others online. And what do they do if they're in a moment where they see that someone else or themselves is not being treated that way? How do they deal with that? Step 6 is about maintaining security and privacy. So in other words, if our kids are going to be doing things online, and again, as they get older, they'll likely be doing more things online, how do they do that in a way where they are keeping both security and privacy in mind? And finally, for step 7, we have consuming critically. Listen, everything that gets thrown at your kids today, they're going to have to make a decision on what is true and what is false, what is real and what is fake, what is right and what is wrong. And they're going to have more media thrown at them than any generation in history, and they need to be equipped to know how to deal with that. And that's step 7, consuming critically. So with all that said, let's go ahead and loop back around to step 1, and let's start talking a little bit about regulating screen time. Now I'm going to ask a question. Now some of this, like this is going to be an audience participation portion. Don't feel like for this part you have to go to a microphone, but later when we do questions, I'll have you go to the microphone. But here, I just want to ask a question. How do we grow closer to God? Prayer? What else? Time in the Word? Anything else? Okay, time with believers. So all of those things together, I think those are all ways that we grow closer to God. Now, I alluded to this morning, but I want to give you a quote. This is actually from it's a Catholic theologian named Ronald Rolheiser, but he wrote this book called The Holy Longing back in the 90s. But he has a quote here that I think is essential for us to read and understand. He says, "Today, a number of historical circumstances are blindly flowing together and accidentally conspiring to produce a climate within which it is not difficult just to think about God or to pray, but simply to have any interior depth whatsoever. We, for every kind of reason, good and bad, are distracting ourselves into spiritual oblivion." Because if you think about it, right, if you go throughout life, and in those difficult moments when you have questions that come up, why am I here? Why am I suffering? Why is this person I know suffering? Why are other people in the world suffering? Why do I have things that people in the other part of the world don't have? If we don't have a chance to go to God and deal in depth with these issues, because it's just easier to open up Netflix and forget about the question, we miss the opportunity to begin to develop that internal depth that is essential. But moving forward, here's another quote from Dr. Marianne Wolf, who's actually a literary scholar, not a believer to my knowledge. And she was talking here about the reality of what they're seeing at the college level. She was actually writing this in response to a study that had been published, and here's what she said. She said, "We should be less concerned with students' cognitive impatience, however, than by what may underlie it. The potential inability of large numbers of students to read with a level of critical analysis sufficient to comprehend the complexity of thought and argument found in more demanding texts." Now, listen. I'm here to tell you that I think the Bible would fall into the category of more demanding text. Who would agree with that? Absolutely. So just keep that in mind for a second. And then a quote that I did share this morning from Dr. Michael Manos that talks about kids 5 or under who have 2 or more hours of daily screen time are 8 times more likely to be diagnosed with focus-related conditions, including ADHD. Now, if you piece these things together, so first, talking about not building that interior depth, talking also about the inability to read more complex text, the inability to stay focused for extended periods of time, like we are actually sabotaging every single one of the ways that we just mentioned that our kids are going to ultimately grow close to God through what's going on in our culture with technology. And this is why one of the things that I start with that I think is so important is parents need to understand screen time isn't just a, hey, my kid spends a little too much time in front of the iPad issue. Ultimately, screen time is a spiritual issue. Now, the question that people immediately ask is, okay, if you're saying screen time is important, how much time should my kid have of screen time? Now listen, I'm going to show you in just a second what our recommendations are, but I want to give you context for it because we do this 2-bucket approach, and so let me explain that. The first bucket that we have is total screen time. So if your kid, if they spend some of the time, for school, and then they spend time doing video games when they get home, and then some time on social media, like all of that counts towards total screen time. Every bit of screen time counts towards total screen time. But there's another bucket, and that's called recreational screen time. So here's the way this works. If your kid has gone through the day, and let's say according to the recommendations that we have, they have 3 hours of total screen time in a day, and let's say they've spent 2 hours, or let's say they spent 2.5 hours at school in front of a screen, that means when they get home, right, they may have time left in that recreational screen time bucket that they've used. But if they've already used up all of their screen time, then when they get home, there's not any screen time left. So let me show you how this plays out. So here are our recommendations, and we've brought this together. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead here. That's my fault. Sorry, I got really excited about sharing you with those numbers. Let's talk briefly here about how we're spending time. So here, in terms of the amount of time, I talked to you earlier today about the 4 years. This is the study that comes from. This is the Common Sense Census study. Now, there is a new and updated one that actually just includes the younger age group, so up to age 8. But with this, the data that we have for teens all the way from 8 to 18, this is where I say they spend 4 years. It actually is 4 years and 208 days of the time between the ages of 8 and 18 that they're spending in front of screens across a variety of activities. Now, I'll tell you that this number is different when we look at girls and boys, but girls we'll see are generally a little bit heavier on the social media side. Boys are generally, and again, always exceptions to this, on the video game side. But at the end, we see the time roughly shake out to be pretty similar overall. Now, with this, one of the things that I tell parents that's absolutely essential for you to understand is this: screen time needs to be regulated from birth, okay? Now, again, I talked about this morning. Again, I want you to understand, I'm not here trying to be judgmental about anything, but what I want you to understand is that we have documented effects from birth. So I'm curious here, how many of you during pediatric well visits have actually had your physician ask about screen time? Okay? I've had a few. There's going to be increasingly more of these asking about both screen time and asking about social media use, because they see this as are some of the biggest impacts to both mental and physical health. And so they actually have been advised to start asking about this on all well visits. So one of the things we've seen, and the reason that we really pushed into this and say, hey, you need to be looking at this from birth, is we have studies like this one. Now, this one actually comes from JAMA Pediatrics, which is the pediatrics version of the Journal of the American Medical Association. And it says here, again, higher levels of screen time in children aged 24 and 36 months, they were already having poor levels on developmental screeners at 36 and 60 months, respectively. And this is part of the reason why the American Academy of Pediatrics actually came out about 5 or 6 years ago and gave recommendations telling parents, listen, from birth to 18 months, there should be absolutely no screen time of any kind in any situation. And then they started to give guidelines for, okay, 18 to 36 months, only co-viewing with parents, limited to half an hour, and then the guidelines increased from there. And that's part of where we build some of our recommendations. But here's what I want you to understand, again, the reality of our culture. By age 2, 4 in 10 children have their own tablet. By age 4, it's 58%. So again, if we're just going along with the current of culture, we're going to be tempted as parents to just put the iPad in the hands of our kids. It actually is dangerous because for us, it becomes a parenting tactic to deal with some of those difficult moments. Now, again, I'm going to be upfront with you guys. Like, I'm here to tell you, one of my kids, who maybe just might be sitting over in the front row over here, when he was younger, he had to go through these in-depth allergy tests. And I don't know if you've ever taken a kid like to one of those tests where literally they're just going to sit there and get poked in the back for like 30 minutes. And then you're going to see like, okay, what reacts and what doesn't. I'm here to tell you, in moments like that, did we use an iPad to help keep him distracted? Sure, we did in those moments. But there's a difference between having moments like that where you choose to use it and having a situation where, as a parent, that's just a tool you go to depend on every single day at different points to keep your child occupied. Because we see that there are effects. And as I mentioned earlier, more screen time makes every digital danger worse. So whether that's a danger to your child in terms of their mental development, or whether it is dangers that they encounter when they're on the different platforms and games and other things that we'll talk about in a bit, it makes all of those worse. And that's why, as a parent, I believe it's so critical, whether you already have kids or whether you are planning to have kids or planning to have more kids, or if you even have kids that are in their late teens, getting a handle on this now is going to equip your child to make better decisions with screen time as they go into adulthood and they go out and start making their own decisions. Because again, here's kind of the news flash, right? It's not just teens that have trouble with managing their screen time. right? I sit behind a lady in church who I'm fairly certain doesn't know what I spend time talking about like every single week, who is sitting there scrolling on Facebook during the sermon pretty much every single Sunday. And part of me has wondered, does she know that I use her as an illustration most everywhere that I go? I don't think so. But I'm hoping one day she'll hear about it secondhand, so we'll see. But I want to give you an example of what I mean when I say screen time makes every digital danger worse, okay? So here's just one example. It's actually on one of the steps we're going to talk about a little later. But this comes from the journal Nature Communications. As they examined this group, they discovered a direct correlation between increased social media use and a decrease in life satisfaction. So I alluded to that this morning. But here's the second side I didn't talk about this morning. There was also a finding across all age groups that a decrease in life satisfaction led to more social media use. Now, here's the thing. If you as a parent say, listen, we're going to put some concrete limits in place to deal with screen time in our home, I'm going to give you some examples later about what some of those things are, you're already putting up a barrier to prevent this from getting out of hand for your child. So you're already protecting. And I'll tell you this, if you as a family decide, listen, we're going to go ahead and implement step one, if you choose to really implement that the way that we recommend it, and you address all the areas that we talk about, and maybe your screen time numbers are a little different than ours, again, it's your decision, it's your home, right? But you're going to be ahead of, honestly, I believe 90% of the families in America in protecting your child from the dangers that come from using devices. That's why step one is so critical. But here's another question. And this is another area where I'm going to be asking for your input. Again, you don't have to go to a microphone for this part, but I want to ask this question. What are our children not doing? So if they all of a sudden have 4 years and 208 days of time to be in front of screens, what are they not doing that previous generations were doing? Reading, playing outside. What else? Coloring. Okay, creative things, yes. Conversation, right? You used to go out in the neighborhood and play with your friends face to face, right? Not just, through various gaming platforms, right? All these things. Being bored, this is huge. There's an author, Andy Crouch, who you might have read his book. He kind of wrote on this topic, but a long time ago, called Tech-Wise Family. And that was one of the things he talked about. He is a musician and a speaker, and he does a lot of things. But he said there is a room in their house where they purposely do not allow devices, but they have musical instruments and painting supplies and drawing supplies and all sorts of things. And the kids are required to spend a certain amount of time in there every day to be able to really be bored and through that become creative, right? That was something he was really passionate about. So I totally agree with that. But there's one thing that I didn't hear any of you all mention that I also want to call out. First of all, everything you've said here is true. But one that has a dramatic effect is sleeping. And this actually has a kind of snowball effect on the mental health crisis that we've talked about as well. It's amazing to think of what losing that much sleep for an entire generation does. And let me tell you, one of the biggest culprits to this is that phone in the bedroom. And it's not just, that your kids are necessarily up doing things that they shouldn't be doing on their phone late at night, although that actually happens quite a bit. But on top of that, it's also the fact of, listen, I need to be able to respond to my friends instantly if they reach out to me on some type of a platform. And so we see kids not only having less sleep, but also having a lower quality of sleep. Because there are some kids that they're so addicted, and we'll talk a little bit about this process later, they're so addicted to getting those notifications on specific platforms and having to respond instantly that their quality of sleep is so lessened. They actually don't get into deeper levels of sleep. It's like their brain is always kind of awake, listening for those notifications to come in. So here's another note that I just want to call out here. And this is also difficult for a lot of parents to hear because it has far-reaching implications. You have to count all screen time. When we look at this data about how screen time affects our kids, it doesn't just factor in, the time that our kids do at home. So if your kids are in front of a screen at school, that also factors into the amount of screen time they're consuming in a given day. So when we're talking about limits, we have to think about that time as well. Now, I realize most of you, you're not there with your kid at school every day, right? You know, some of you might be homeschooling your kids, but if your kids are going to a school, public, private, whatever, they're going to have time that they're in front of a screen and you might not know how much. And this is a great opportunity to just reach out to the teacher and say, listen, I'm not here to, judge or try to adjust your instructional methods, but I just want to know on a given day, how much screen time do you think the kids are consuming there? And when we get to our recommendations in just a second, that I tried to jump to earlier, when you get to our recommendations, you need to keep that in mind, that in that total screen time bucket, you have to account for the time they're doing educational work as well, not just the time that they're doing things like video games. So here's the two-bucket approach that I mentioned, and our recommendations are based off of what we have seen in the data, and so we're trying to bring it to families in a format that they can easily consume. Now again, I want to tell you this, in your home, you have to make a decision about what these limits need to be. We're giving you recommendations. I've known some families that have done a little bit more because they felt like it'd be really hard to cut down to the levels that we recommend, but we're just presenting these here as a starting place for you. Now let's talk about this, because I want you to understand this bucket system. So total screen time, this is truly a total screen time. So let's say you have a 12-year-old. So the 12-year-old down there, it says 3.5 hours of total screen time and then 1 hour of recreational screen time. Let's talk through that. If your child goes to school, and let's say they're in front of a screen for 3 hours as a 12-year-old, when they get home, there is half an hour left of total screen time. So even though they have an hour of recreational screen time, there's only half an hour left of total. So they could spend half an hour sitting down, playing a video game, or getting on social media, whatever you choose to allow them to do with that time. But again, they have to stay within that total screen time limit. So that is why that limit is put into place. Now, here's the thing, right? If your child goes to school as a 12-year-old, and let's say they're in front of a screen for 4.5 hours a day, and that is not as uncommon as you would think, then when they get home, they're already at a deficit. And so what you need to do as a parent is to maximize non-screen activities and not let them go and jump in front of a screen, because their brain has had enough of screen time for that day in their developmental stage. And so they need to be doing other things. They need to be doing the things you all just talked about. Their physical activity. They need to be reading. They need to be doing creative things. They need to be getting bored and having to figure out what to do. And then when it's time to go to bed, they need to be sleeping. So this is our two-bucket approach. Again, you as a family will have to decide what limits make sense. But I want you to remember our call earlier to be biblical, intentional, and countercultural. You will look different when you do this. Now, let me call out another piece of this. This might be a conversation that you need to have with other people that are in your children's life. For example, grandparents. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I have seen grandparents that are the spiritual foundation for their grandchildren, and they have poured into them greatly. But in some situations, I've also seen grandparents who also just basically give their grandkids free access to their devices to go and do whatever. They're not even sure all the things they're doing on them, and that becomes a concern. So one of the things that's great to do is, if you, and maybe there's babysitters involved, maybe there's other family members that help care for your kids, is being able to get together and just have a conversation and say, listen, we feel convicted based off of God's word that we want to address this. We want to be intentional with it. Because of that, we've set some limits that we want to have in place. And here is what the limits are for our kids. And so we'll try to give you some insight if we're dropping them off, if they need to have screen time, or if they actually need to be done because they've already consumed enough for that given day. So there could be conversations you need to have there. Now, I don't believe that you, as a parent, should just immediately go to your kids and say, here's the limit, that's it, and not really approach this from a discipleship perspective. Because ultimately, everything we talk about here is a form of discipleship. That was kind of the point of the message this morning, in saying we have to disciple our children to be Christians in this culture. So if we just tell our kids, go do this because I said so, we're missing an opportunity. So I'm going to give you access to a couple of resources, and at the very end, I'm going to give you a link where you can go get these resources. So one of them is a Bible study. Now, there's a Bible study specifically here for step one, where we talk about how we honor God with the time that we've been given. And it has options whether your kids are older or younger. so that you can kind of customize it, but it gives you an opportunity to sit down with your kids and say, okay, let's talk about what the Bible says about how we use our time. And it's actually going to go through some of the verses we talked about this morning. But then it's going to be able to help you jump into a discussion about how do we honor God with time. And then you're going to get to say, listen, here are some things we've talked about for our family, and here are some things that we're going to implement. Now, here's the catch. A part of what you do for step one, and I'm going to give you access to this as well, is filling out what we call a family screen time plan. Step one of the family screen time plan, your kids will never see. This is for you and your spouse or whoever else is involved kind of pouring into the life of your kids to sit down together and talk about your digital habits and what you're modeling to your kids through your own digital habits. And so you're going to need to talk about, okay, are there some things that we need to start, stop, continue, or change for our digital lives so that our kids can see a good example? Now, once you get all of that in place, then you get to step two. Step two of the family screen time plan is where you really look at, what your kids will be doing in the home with technology. And this is the part they will see. And this is where you try to answer questions like, where in the home can devices be used? When can devices be used? What devices can be used? What are the limits? This is where you'll actually define the limits that you're going to have in your home. So this is an essential step. So just to kind of walk through, and again, if you don't have time to go through digital parenting fundamentals, if you just say, hey, I want to address this, I'm going to give you some action steps that you can take, that you can start on tonight as a family to begin to address. First, I want you to complete that family screen time plan that I was just talking about. Then, I want you to go through and actually implement those screen time limits. Don't have there be a huge delay. Like, come up with the limits and then push into it and really implement those limits. But as a part of introducing those limits is to then go in and lead your children through that free Bible study that's talking all about how we honor God with our time. Okay? So that's step one. Now, we're going to push ahead here. We're going to talk about a couple of additional steps, and then we're going to have some time here at the end to go through Q&A. So I just want to let you know, if you're queuing up some questions, like, that's a good thing. We will have time to go through questions in just a little bit. But I want to kind of transition now and talk a little bit more about mental health. We just alluded to this morning, and I want to push in and talk about the data at a deeper level. So, as I mentioned, there was an article in The Atlantic that was titled that America's teenage girls are not okay. And so this article says the numbers are undeniable. The Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which is published by the CDC and Prevention, is the gold standard for measuring the state of teen behavior and mental health. From 2011 to 2021, the survey found the share of teenage girls who say they feel persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness increased up to 57%, with the highest jump coming during the coronavirus pandemic. The share of girls who says they've contemplated suicide increased 50% in the decade. So this is not we're just kind of going through a rough patch. There are huge changes that are happening. And as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Jean Twenge in her book Generations clearly said every indicator of mental health and psychological well-being has become more negative among teens and young adults since 2012. But let's look at data. Let's really push into this and look at data. So we have a study here, and this study actually comes from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, and this is self-reporting a major depressive episode. And so here, we're going to look at the data through 2011, and you can see here this data remains relatively unchanged. Small fluctuations, no big fluctuations. The darker line here that's kind of up to that 10% mark is going to be girls. The dotted line closer to the bottom is going to be boys. But if we move forward past that inflection point that I mentioned this morning, we can see that this number truly begins to skyrocket, with now over 1 in 4 girls reporting that they had a major depressive episode within the last year. Now, if we look, there's so many different thoughts. Some of you here might have actually had a chance to read the book by Dr. Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation. And in this book, he talks about a lot of different facets to this. I would encourage you, if you truly just want a psychologist's perspective, a social psychologist looking at all of this and giving information, it's a great book to read. Again, from a Christian perspective, again, he's not a believer. In terms of figuring out what to do with that, that's one of the challenges. That's part of the reason we think that we exist at digitalparenting.com, is to try to help bridge the gap there. But here's one of the things he says. Girls are exposed to more cruelty and bullying because social media platforms incentivize and facilitate relational aggression. The twisted incentive structures of social media reward the most extreme presentation of symptoms, right? Let's just be honest. On social media, people being nice to each other, is that generally what rises to the top? No. And what I want you all to understand, as being someone from the tech world, is when you have large amounts of behavioral data, they can actually begin to try to control your behavior by the way they present things to you. And it's really, if you think about it again, if you're a teenager today, that's not really fair. These tech companies have so much data to try to twist and try to make you feel a certain way. They're actually doing that on purpose. And they're trying to do that on purpose to try to get you to maximize the amount of time you spend in that app. Why? Because they make money off of you. As a note here, and I just want to reiterate this, parents, I want you to get this. Tech companies do not care about your children. They will only implement controls for you when they absolutely have to. When truly there's threats from the government or other agencies to come in and do something, that's when they'll implement levels of controls, but they're never going to be enough to fully deal with the challenges that these platforms face. Now let's move forward again. We talked a little bit about non-fatal self-harm this morning. Again, situations where someone has harmed themselves not to the point of death, but they've actually harmed themselves to where they have to be admitted into the hospital. Now, this is a different study looking at the same data that we talked about this morning. So we're going to get a slightly different number off this one. So here, if we can see again, the data through about 2007 remains relatively constant. If we look specifically now at that year, the shaded area there between 2010 and 2015, compared with earlier records, we see a 518% increase since 2007 and 2008. So again, significant issues that are changing. Now, this usually is tied to like world events, right? So for example, I'm sure if you go through and studied in the Ukraine, for example, overall mental health, you would see huge changes since the beginning of the war with Russia, right? That makes sense because there's major world events happening. We're seeing similar kind of things happen here, but without anything to connect it to. And this is where we have to begin to start looking and asking the question, why? Now, here's another piece to this. I want you to also see this. Now, this is a chart that's going to show you the suicide rate change. You're going to see it between different groups. It's probably too small for you to make out all the specifics, but just here to give you an insight here, when we look at the females of age 10 to 19, we can see this again pretty much going all the way from something, again, kind of around mid-level here, all the way up to above 40 per 100,000. This is a substantial increase. Something that should lead all of us to say, hey, what should we do about this? Now, as I mentioned earlier, this was something that was actually brought to the attention of the Surgeon General of the United States. So he actually came out, and this was several years ago before the current administration, but he even came out then and said, listen, if parents can band together and say, you know, as a group, we're not going to allow our kids to use social media until 16 or 17 or 18 or whatever age they choose, that is a much more effective strategy in making sure your kids don't get exposed to harm early. Now, let me just tell you, I understand the pressure on you if you're here and you're a teen. I also understand the pressure that's on your parents. I remember, I tell this story because I think it just helps us all level set on today's culture. So I showed up one Sunday morning early. Up until recently, when I've been traveling a little bit more for digital parenting, I taught 7th grade boys. I actually started with this group all the way back when they were in 6th grade and followed them up through 8th grade. And had a blast with them. Let me just tell you, taking 6th grade boys to youth camp for the first time is an unbelievable and exhausting experience. Unique. Yeah, I did have, to give you just that in a snapshot, also to give us a little bit of levity in the midst of all this, I remember I had a parent one time message me and say, why did my 6th grade boy come back with all the clean clothes I sent him with and didn't wear any of them? I think the rest of us knew the answer to that question like halfway through the week, but that's another topic altogether. So anyway, but I showed up early one Sunday morning to get my classroom ready. I was going to write some stuff on the whiteboard, and the way our middle school section is, There's not like big giant walls. You can kind of hear from one section to another. And across the divider were two 7th grade girls. And these girls were talking about how the one girl could create a PowerPoint presentation to convince her parents to let her onto Instagram. And she was saying, like, okay, you need to remind them how much responsibility you've shown. You need to talk to them about this and all this. You need to talk to them about all your friends that their parents have already let them on Instagram, and how you're feeling left out and all of this. And one of the things I bring up with that is they weren't making that stuff up. That was real pressure. That was real societal pressure that was placed on that one girl to be on Instagram, and she wanted to be on there with every fiber of her being. And this other girl was doing what I'm sure she thought what a good friend would do, and trying to help her to figure out how to convince her parents to let her on there. Listen, one of the things I just want to tell you guys, no matter what age you are, if we're approaching this topic and we're saying things like, I can't believe this generation, or why do young people today think, listen, that is not the way I believe God wants us to do this. If we were in the current generation, we would be doing the same things that the current generation is doing. This isn't something they're making up. This is real pressure. Their social fabric goes through online platforms and specifically social media. And so if you are telling them, listen, we believe it's best for you to not be on these platforms, there is going to be a cost for them, but it's one that we have to approach them and say, listen, we're called to be followers of Jesus, and at times we're going to be different. We're going to have to be countercultural, and this might be one area where you're going to be different. But understand that needs to be something that you tell your kids with a deep, deep level of empathy for what they're going to have to go through with that decision. It's not easy. So what do you do in this area? First of all, I would encourage you to delay social media access until developmentally appropriate. Here's the interesting thing. And I know I've talked a lot about girls for this particular topic, and it's because they generally spend more time on social media, and we have seen the effects be greater with them. We'll talk about other areas that are affecting boys, and trust me, there are huge issues that we'll need to address with boys. For example, we have an entire generation who have just decided that it's perfectly fine for them to just make the entire focus of their life these video games that are coming out, and they're pouring hours and hours into it. And they're not choosing to explore other issues. They're not investing in academics. They're not investing in sports. And this is a huge, huge concern. And again, I've taught this group up until recently at our church, and I can tell you that is a very real risk. But here with girls, I believe that the situation is urgent. And the interesting thing is, girls who get on social media in that younger period, 10 to 14, this is the danger zone. Their difficulty with the realities of social media will continue into those early 20s. However, if your child, if she were to get on social media later, let's say 16 or 17, the interesting thing is they don't have any of the issues that the younger group has, and they won't develop them, right, later on for the most part. Again, every person's different. So the thing is, the age at which your child is exposed to something is essential. Because I'll have parents that say things like, listen, social media is how this generation communicates. So my kid needs to know how to operate in that, right? Which I understand. But let's put that in another context, okay? If I were to say, listen, the way people travel is with cars. So my 7-year-old needs to be able to take the car and just go wherever they want to go, right? None of us would say that. Age is important. And with social media, especially, and again, I've got a daughter who's 15, our preteen and teen daughters, they don't always have the ability to deal with the dangers and difficulties and insults and other things that come through social media and not have it affect them. So delaying social media until developmentally appropriate is essential. But the other big piece to this is, and here's where the cool thing is about our 7 steps of digital parenting. If you've already implemented step 1, you're already putting a barrier around your children when it comes to social media, because you're limiting the amount of time they can be on there, which will limit its effect. Next, talk with your children about the effects of social media and its temptation, right? How many of you have, as adults, have had something on social media that made you feel mad or sad or jealous, right? Hopefully all of us raise our hands, because I'm here to tell you that this is a regular occurrence. But here's the thing, right? Have we told our kids that? You know, there's times that when I look at stuff on social media, I feel jealous of someone else. Your kids get to develop a superpower if you're sitting down and discipling them to understand these feelings that are going to be coming in and knowing how to deal with them. We are depriving them of that if we just basically say, you figure it out. So talk with your child. I'm going to give you a discussion guide you can also use as a part of this. That'll be one of the resources that I highlight too at the end. But I want to push into our third step here before we jump into Q&A. So I'm going to be spending about 10 minutes on this, and then we're going to open this up for Q&A. But here is this third one, defending against predators. Now, this is where we're really talking about, again, limiting access to our family and building up awareness. Because here's the thing, right? It's hard in 2025 with some of the conversations we will need to have with our kids. It is hard. But again, God has called us to be parents or grandparents or whatever role you're in 2025, so I believe He will provide the strength you need to do it. But let's talk about a few different situations. I want to start off with Braden Marcus. Braden Marcus was a young man who, on a Sunday morning, after a big football weekend there in his school in Ohio, as a 15-year-old, he needed to get some homework done. So on Sunday morning, he went onto his computer. He decided that he was going to get this stuff knocked out really quick, but while he was doing his schoolwork, on his phone, he got a direct message on Instagram from a girl who was around his age in a nearby town. Now, he looked at it, she looked really attractive, and he thought, well, let's kind of start that conversation. So he dove into it, and he started talking with her, and long story short, over a period of time, and again, I'm not going to be super explicit here, but he ended up sending some inappropriate things to that account. Well, come to find out, that was not a teenage girl around his age. That actually was a professional blackmailer, in essence. And that person demanded that immediately he should send $1,200 in Bitcoin, or else he would send out this information to everybody that Braden knew. Now, Braden begged and begged. He got off. So they had actually jumped onto Google Hangouts. He got off that. The person continued to message him again on Instagram and went back and forth. And Braden begged and begged that this person would not release the inappropriate content. The person didn't relent. And Braden, unfortunately, took his own life. That entire process from that friend request until Braden took his life was 26 minutes from beginning to end. And so part of the thought here for a lot of parents is, I can deal with this later. I can deal with this later. But there are some things that if your children are going to be online against people who are far more skilled than they are at navigating the platforms and navigating just, again, the different ways that you can interact online, they need to understand what to do in moments like that. One conversation could have changed the outcome for Braden. Now, this particular type of issue has become such a big deal that the FBI has actually had to develop its own unit to address this, and it's called sextortion. So when predators pose as someone else online to coerce victims into taking and sending sexually explicit photos and videos, and then immediately demand payment or threaten release the photo to the victim's family and friends, it's known as financially motivated sextortion. And during a small period of time, just when we had some sample data on this, and this goes all the way through March of 2023, there were 12,600 victims with, unfortunately, with this group, about 20 suicides. Now, this has continued to increase, and this is especially targeting boys, especially boys between 13 and 17. And this, even with AI, we won't have a chance to talk about this a huge amount, but this has actually become even more difficult for a lot of those boys to navigate with some of the things people can do with AI-related images. And so at times, I'll have parents that come to me and say, listen, my son, he's 15, he's more than capable to handle his online life. I just trust him, he's gonna be good to go with it. Do you trust him with people whose entire profession and livelihood is to exploit them as victims? And I think for most of us, the answer to that would have to be no. But unfortunately, far too many parents have just left that door wide open and haven't prepared their kids for what to do in moments like that. But that's not it. Because the reality is, again, in 2025, we also have to have difficult conversations with our kids about authority figures. So this is Danielle Medellin from New York. And she had at one point sent over 5,000 flirtatious texts with a specific boy in her class. Now listen, again, in 2025, I would love it if I didn't have to talk to my kids about what happens if an authority figure sends them something inappropriate. But again, God has called us to be parents in 2025. And this is one of the dangers that we have to address head on. And so when we have moments like this, I would ask you the question, does your child know what to do in these scenarios? And specifically, I would ask you, have you told them? Because a lot of times as parents, we can assume that our kids will react a certain way in the moment, but we haven't really prepared them for that. They haven't thought about it ahead of time. And we can push in and look at some other examples. So I'll give you some examples here, one being from Roblox. How many of you have ever heard of Roblox? Okay? Yeah, it's pretty popular. They're now a $4 billion company, right? So think of that along the same level as companies like Western Union or Crocs. I still can't believe Crocs became a $4 billion company, but that's neither here nor there. But the platform has over 69 million active users every single day, and it generates $4 billion, as I mentioned earlier. Now, I want to give you a news story that actually just came out a couple of days ago, and that was here that we actually have a specific predator that groomed a 10-year-old girl and used basically the currency that they have on that particular platform to bribe this girl into doing things that were inappropriate. And to help you get an idea of the level of indifference that the leadership of this particular company has, so for example, their CEO actually sent a cease and desist letter to somebody on YouTube that was trying to search out predators on his platform, right? Basically, we're saying legally you can't do that according to their perspective, which also is not true, but that's another note altogether. And so, the reality of what we see with this is that their chief, here's a quote from the article, the chief executive officer is facing a wave of fury after his company sent a cease and desist letter to a YouTuber known for exposing alleged child predators on the online gaming platform. That's just a reminder that, again, these tech platforms do not have your child's best interest at heart. But I want to talk about another one that is just as dangerous, and that is Snapchat. So one of the things about Snapchat that it's dangerous, and it's not the only app that does this, but it exploits something called the online disinhibition effect. So let's talk about the online disinhibition effect first. So there is kind of this feeling that if you're doing something online, it's not quite real, right? Because if I think back for the moment, like if I wanted to do something illegal as a 15-year-old, like I had to go search, like I had to go like to some seedy parts of town and figure out something to do, right? Like it wasn't just like super easy to go and do something illegal, right? But now you can be sitting at home on your bed, in your bedroom with your phone out and totally destroy someone else's life with your words, right? You can go through and do illegal things. You can go buy and sell drugs online. Like it is so much easier. And part of the reason for this is because it's online, it almost feels in some ways mentally like it's not real. And then Snapchat takes that to another level. Again, for those of you that are familiar with the platform, you post content and then after a period of time, it goes away. And so it almost makes it seem like you're able to do things and you don't get any consequences from that, and eventually it will go away, right? If you ever remember the old ad campaign, which was just absolutely horrible, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? It's kind of the same thought, but here on a digital platform. What happens on Snapchat stays in Snapchat. But as we all know, things that happen can affect our souls. And when we look, I want to tell you a story. So there was a guy named Alexander McCarthy who was actually sentenced. He's from Northern Ireland, and I want to tell you a story about this girl in the U.S. who actually was from West Virginia. So her name is Simran Thomas. Now you can see her here with her family. She has siblings here whose faces are blacked out. But unfortunately, she was given access to Snapchat at the age of 10. And again, as I mentioned earlier, our kids, the age at which they're exposed to content and they're exposed to platforms is essential. And I can guarantee you that, first of all, a 10-year-old is not legally allowed to have an account on Snapchat, but the platform itself doesn't do a whole lot to prevent that. But with this, she again is going to be encountering people that are far more skilled at her at navigating this particular platform. And in her case, she ended up starting to meet with someone who appeared to be a girl her age, and then similar to the story that we mentioned with Braden Marcus, there was some things that happened where she sent something that was objectionable to the person and then found out, oh, this is actually a middle-aged guy. And what happened was he then used that to blackmail her over and over and over again. And when she would block that account, this guy would go find another account and would go and contact her again. Oh, she blocked that account. He'd go and find another account. He'd appear as somebody else. He might seem like somebody else for 5 minutes of the conversation, and then she'd realize, oh, it's this guy again. She ended up taking her own life because she simply couldn't get away from this, and because he was holding this over her head. And if you go back, if you read, and you can see this in some of the official inquests that went into this, if you go back and read these text messages, it is a reminder that there is evil in this world. He had no remorse for leading her very clearly to commit suicide, even telling her at one point, just go do it. And she was 10. Unfortunately, the ramifications extended even far beyond her. They didn't know why she killed herself. They had no idea. They didn't find out until months and months later, and unfortunately in that interim time, her dad took his own life, not able to deal with the realities of what had happened to his daughter. They only found out later, when they actually caught this guy, Andrew McCarthy, that they actually began to search his devices, and this is where they began to understand what had unfolded. She was not his only victim. She was only one of about 16,000 victims from this one guy, all on Snapchat. So I'm going to ask you a question. This is another audience participation portion. Again, just from your seat, feel free to answer this. What information do you think could have saved her life? Absolutely, right? Part of the thing with her, and I didn't tell you all the story, but this makes your answer even more true in understanding the whole story. She was struggling at that point. They were not a Christian family. She was struggling at that point with her body image. She was struggling at that point with, again, because of things that society placed on her. She was trying to decide her sexuality. Again, this was that time when that was a huge, big deal. And so you begin to look at that. She was going to this platform to try to find a level of community and people to understand her. So if that could have been something that she could have found outside of that platform, and to be honest, if she just hadn't been given the option to go into that platform, it absolutely would have changed things. Anything else? Absolutely. And I think that's true for her. I think that's true for Braden Marcus and for so many of the stories I haven't even shared with you this morning. If you go to your kids, the one thing you need to get right in this area is if your kid feels unsafe or uncomfortable with something that happens online, they need to come to you, and they need to get you to help deal with it. And there's going to be, unless you have this conversation with them, there's going to be a tendency for them to not do that. Because they're going to think, and I hate to be honest, like as Christian families, sometimes the pressure on them is even higher to not come to you because they don't want to expose the reality of what they've gotten into. And in a lot of cases, they've gotten in over their head with something that just went way further, and now they can't control it, and they're not sure what to do. So here's one of the things that I want to encourage all of you to do. Your children need to first be skeptical, and second, they need to be able to identify red flags early. Okay? Let's talk about each of those things. Skeptical. So first of all, your child needs to understand that chances are every single person that they meet online is not going to be who they say they're going to be, right? And that could be, random people that reach out. Even, sometimes there was actually a famous case of middle school girls where you actually had middle school girls from this one school pretending to be another girl from the school so that they could be friends with somebody else on Instagram so they could get dirt to then use on that girl later. Right? So there's all these types of misinformation that can happen through online platforms. Teach our kids to be skeptical. Just don't believe it. Let them know, chances are that attractive person of the opposite sex is more than likely a middle-aged man somewhere else in this country. As long as you know that going into it, you'll probably make some better decisions. But here's some things you can do. First of all, again, communicate red flags with your children that would lead them to come to you. So let me give you an example of that. You need to teach your child that communication with an authority figure is not a personal conversation, right? It's generally about something specific, right? So if a teacher is texting you, then if that's anything that goes outside of the bounds of specifically what you're doing in class, they need to come to you, because that's going to prevent that from kind of spinning out of control and getting to a level where it shouldn't be. And maybe it's something that's harmless, but maybe it's not. I'll give you an example from a family that we talked with at one point, and they had a daughter who was in, I believe at the time, 5th grade, and there was a teacher who knew that they had just been on a beach vacation, and it was like, oh, can you send me some pictures of your beach vacation? Now, at first glance, if you're a 5th grader, that might not seem like a weird thing. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. But we as parents know, hey, hold on a minute here. There's something that's not quite right with that. And because ultimately it's like, wait, is he wanting to see a picture of you in your bathing suit? Is that really it? And so here, again, if we give our kids the ability to spot those red flags early, then again, the conversations aren't going to get to the point where they've spun out of control. Next, and as I mentioned earlier, teach your child through examples that they should always be skeptical online. Don't just tell them, hey, be skeptical. One of the things we encourage, and we do this in our discussion guides, is you give your kids scenarios. So, oh, you're on this platform. Somebody reaches out with a friend request, right? It's a really attractive girl about your age, right? What do you do? Okay, and this is a good example where you talk through that and then you can explain, listen, anyone can pretend to be someone else online. Now, let me tell you how crazy this has gotten, okay? With AI, no longer is a photo or a video or an audio clip proof of truth of anything, right? So what's crazy is I just did a whole promotional video for Digital Parenting Fundamentals, and other than the pics or the videos of me talking, every single part of the video is AI generated. And it's crazy how good this stuff has gotten. And so you might have, somebody who sends a photo, even sends video of themselves pretending to be a teenage girl around your age. That still doesn't mean that that's the person who it looks like, right? So we need to teach our kids, again, to be skeptical and to remind them that, again, in today's day and time, most anything can be faked. And then also there's a discussion guide I've also provided that provides you with some of those scenarios that you can help talk through. Again, just meaning to be a discussion point so that you can help your kids deal with the challenges that come from predators. Because again, it's not always just some random person on the other side of the internet. It can be an authority figure who's using technology as a digital communication channel as well. So let me point out a few things. First of all, and I'm going to go ahead and hand the iPad here back to Keegan. First of all is we do have a book that's available that's called the Digital Parenting Guidebook. So if you really want to push down a little bit deeper into these topics, and maybe you don't want to dive in and take the whole class, but you really want to research this, I would encourage you to take a look at the Digital Parenting Guidebook. You can also get this on Amazon, pretty much anywhere where you can buy books, you can get this book, but you can also get the audio book and the ebook version. And so back there at the table, Keegan has some copies of the books left, and then we also have a QR code if you want to just go get it on Amazon. Because I travel a lot, I'm an audiobook guy, right? So that option is available to you. The other thing I want to call out is we do have the companion course that goes alongside this. And so the companion course called Digital Parenting Fundamentals, which you all are going to be doing here, this will take you through each of the 7 steps, and it'll take you through some additional content as well to kind of help you address this as a family. And you're going to get a workbook that goes along with the guidebook, and you'll actually get both of those if you take the class, and so you'll be able to walk through this content together. Now, I mentioned earlier that I was going to give you some resources. So this is the QR code and the link. They're both the same, so whichever method works for you. You can go to our site, and this is specifically for you guys. It's going to give you some access to free downloads that you can use to address the items that we've talked about today. So it actually gives you some downloadable resources you can use for each of these 3 steps we've talked about. And again, you can begin to apply these concepts even if you never touch another digitalparenting.com resource. I honestly believe that these can help you in your journey. Now, I have talked for a long time, but I'm super interested to hear questions that you all have. So if you have questions, I would just encourage you to come up to the microphone and ask, and we'll take through and we'll address these for about 15 minutes, and then I will stay after, and I will answer any questions that you have once we wrap up if there's things you don't necessarily want to ask in front of the whole group. Okay, so does anyone have questions?
So I was wondering, I'm not very savvy on social media or anything like that because I don't really use it.
Yep.
So there's going to be new technologies that come out in the next 5 years when my kids are going to be wanting to get on social media.
Yep.
How do we know what resources can we use to know what to expect?
Yeah. So eventually we're going to have some of those resources. We don't have them all yet for these new platforms, but I would encourage you to go to sites like Common Sense Media. So Common Sense Media is going to give you an overview of an application, what the dangers are, because you're right, there are new platforms all the time, right? So, and it's every generation has a new thing that comes out, right? I remember back when Instagram was the biggest thing. Now, like younger people, like Instagram's not quite, that's kind of, we're moving backwards in time now, and TikTok's not even always the newest thing. So as a parent, one of the things I would encourage you to do is to communicate with your kids early. Hey, if you want to get on a platform, be prepared that I, as a parent, am going to take some time to research it and understand it before I give you an answer. I'm not just going to give you an answer right away. And just let them know ahead of time. The other thing that you can do that's pretty powerful is you can just let them know ahead of time, like, listen, when it comes to social media, anything in that realm, or again, whatever topic you're talking about, I want you to know that you're probably going to be later, you're going to be delayed at this. I want you to know that your friends are probably going to get access to this before you, but I want to give you some reasons why. And as long as you can do something there to keep it from being a surprise to them, they're going to be better able to deal with that. So I would just encourage you to kind of approach it in that way. Thanks.
Yeah, I got one.
Yes.
I'm a grandparent.
Yes.
And obviously my grandkids have other grandparents.
Yes.
So how do we deal with them? Because if the grandkids aren't at our house, how do we deal with that and not exposing them to, because their other grandkids
Yes.
are on screen time like 24/7.
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I'll talk about this, and then I'm going to go into one other facet of this after I answer this. I think it depends on how willing they are to work with you on it. I think if one of the things we think is valuable about our resources is you don't have to go to them and say, here, you need to do this, this, and this. Sometimes being able to give them one of our books or point them to our resources might be a great way to just let them understand, like, oh, this is something I need to pay attention to. But if they aren't, I mean, I think one of the things, again, that I would encourage is just, try to come up with guidelines of, hey, listen, this is what we're trying to work towards, and here's why we're trying to do it. We would love for you all to come alongside. And if they're not willing to do that, one of the things you'll have to do, and this is hard, but you have to then put it on the shoulders of your children to make the right decisions in those moments. And that's not an easy thing to do, but at that point, you're going to have to say, and for your grandchildren, you're going to have to put it a little bit on their shoulders and say, listen, you might be around cousins or other people that are doing all these things, like you're going to have to be different. And don't sit there. If they want to show you videos on their phone, let's just say, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to watch that. Whatever the case is, you're going to have to be a little different in those moments. But again, I would encourage you to, if you can, work with them. The other thing where this comes up, and this is the other facet I want to talk about, is co-parenting situations are very, very hard. Because we have had some families that have come through where one of the parents says, listen, I want to follow God in this. I want my child to be obedient in this. And you have the other parent who's truly going the other direction. And I'm talking about parents that believe, like, yeah, let them access anything they want online. That's how they're going to learn about all this stuff in the world. And that's perfectly fine. They need to be able to do that, right? And in those moments, it's almost unfair. But if you're in that boat, you're going to have to work with the kid directly and say, listen, we're going to have to teach you how to make the right decision in these moments. And that's going to be hard. That's in a lot of ways, that's unfair to put on their shoulders. But when you have another parent who's not willing to come to the table at all, sometimes that's what you have to do. So, okay.
Thank you. I really liked your evidence-based literature that you put out there. My question is two parts. First part is, do you know if there's any evidence-based literature out there in terms of when a child should have their own cell phone? The second part is, when did you allow your 3 children to have their own cell phone? So if you could comment on that, and what restrictions did you put specifically on cell phone use?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let's talk through those things. First of all, I will tell you that when to get my child a cell phone is the number one question I get asked by a factor of like 1,000. So with this, I'll tell you what we did in our home first. So my boys, Caden and Keegan, they did not get cell phones until they got their driver's license and they were going to be driving. Now, I say this to say, I'm going to call out something here, just so, again, I'm trying to be fully transparent. We're a homeschooled family, and that means some things are a little bit different for us. And we didn't have as many circumstances where it was like we needed to get a hold of our kids when they weren't going to be in a situation that we were around them. So I do understand that every circumstance is different. My daughter Brenna actually got a phone when she was like 15 and a half, or actually a little earlier. She's about 15 and a half now. She got it a little bit earlier than the boys did, but the same thing. Again, we gave them all TrueMe phones. That's a type of phone that actually has a lot of controls built in. I also would encourage you to take a look at the Bark phone, which is an Android-based phone that also has parental controls actually baked into the operating system. They've actually modified Android to have some parental controls at a deeper level than what you can with basic Android or with an iPhone. Those are all good choices. And those give you the ability to control what apps, the amount of time, all those things that your kid uses. So as an example, on Keegan's phone, on Caden's phone, on Brenna's phone, all of them right now, they don't even have a web browser that they can access. Now there's some times when that's a little annoying, right? They go into their life group and they're like, oh, we're gonna send out this, this link that you can do and you can get our discussion guide for today. And I have to tell the teachers, like, listen, my kids aren't gonna be able to get to that. You just need to be aware of that. So there's those kinds of things that happen. In terms of when do children need phones, I'm gonna give you 3 questions to ask that I think are gonna help answer that question a little bit better. But I also wanna call out before I do those 3 questions, as a parent, if there is a situation where you need to communicate with your child, you do not have to jump straight to a smartphone, okay? There are a lot of different options that are out there, because I've known situations, going back to co-parenting situations, where a parent wants to have access to talk to their child, and they needed it at a younger age than what they felt like the kids could handle a smartphone, but there are a lot of good devices out there that aren't smartphones that you can give your kid if you just need to know where they are and you need to be able to text them or call them, right? So don't feel like you have to jump right to a smartphone. But here's the 3 questions. The first question is, do I feel like I as a parent have properly trained my child to deal with the temptations that will come from having a phone? Okay? The second question is, in terms of your child, has my child shown the level of responsibility that is required when having a phone? Right? If you're going to give them a $300 piece of equipment, have they shown that they're responsible for being able to manage that? And the third question is, do I right now have time to properly train them to use that phone in a God-honoring way? Now what's interesting are 2 of those questions have nothing to do with your kid. They have to do with you and your time to pour into them around this. But the third one is about your kid. Here's what I would say. I don't think there's a lot of cases for your kids to have phones before 13, certainly. Again, if you need communication with them prior to that, then I would encourage you to look at other devices, right? There are devices that kind of are similar to smartphones, but not, like the Gab phone, if you've seen that. There are smart watches where your kids can communicate with only a select group of people. Again, look at those kinds of devices and not jump straight to a smartphone, right? And again, I would encourage you to wait as long as you can, but if you need them to have a device, again, explore non-smartphone options. Sorry, I kind of talked in a circle there, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight and answers a little bit of the question there. Yes?
David, I think he also asked about any evidence-based literature that you can point to.
Yeah, so the problem is with evidence-based literature around phones is developmentally, there's different things we're looking at, right? So phones give access to a lot of different platforms, and so that's why a lot of the data we see is looking at the effects of social media, right? Or the effects of video gaming and those kinds of things. The phone itself, it's hard to find something that's just evidence-based on the phone because it depends on what your child does with it, ultimately, that makes the difference. I can give you references to some studies that talk about kind of some of those side effects to the things that come on the phone. But the cool thing about that is then if you get your child a phone that doesn't have some of those abilities on it, then you totally, again, you get to kind of skip over some of those studies because they don't apply to the kind of device that your child has. So I'll chat with you a little bit after and we can dive a little bit deeper into that if you'd like to. Cool. Awesome. Yes?
So I have 2 questions actually, but first is screen time.
Yes.
Like I know Apple phones have like a little screen time setting.
Yep.
Do you recommend putting something on their phone to kind of help monitor that screen time where?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, I believe software limits can be really helpful. So for example, on iOS, you do have the screen time feature, right, on Microsoft, which includes both your Microsoft Windows computers, but also things like your Xbox. You have Microsoft Family Safety, which allows you to set limits. You have similar limits on like a PlayStation and a Nintendo Switch. Mac also, the screen time feature also works on Apple computers, but here's the problem, right? Most families I talk to, they have multiple of those devices. And there's nothing that unifies all of that together to help track your kids' screen time across, like going from their iPad to a Nintendo Switch and then a Windows computer in the family home. Like, so this is where there's always a little bit of that's going to be a manual process, but wherever you can, use limits that are on the device. And I tell this story because I think this really helps illustrate it. I was talking to a family in Chattanooga. They're actually both very well educated, both have PhDs, and they had a kid that they thought was developing a debilitating illness. He was in, I think, 3rd or 4th grade, and literally over the course of a month, this kid just got worse and worse and worse. They actually had taken him to the hospital. And what they came to find out was their kid was like going to sleep for like an hour and then waking up and playing Minecraft until like 5 a.m. every day for about a month. And so they began to realize all this deterioration was because of a lack of sleep. Now, here's the thing, right? If your internet or your device, whatever, turns off for your kids at a certain time, that totally prevents that from happening. You remove that temptation from them. And that's a good example where software limits can really help you. If you can go to your router and say, listen, the internet for all the devices that my kids can use turns off at 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. or whatever, right? And it's not going to turn back on until the morning. You don't have to worry as much about that. Same thing with screen time on iOS devices. Here's the only thing I will say. You do have to, with some platforms, do a better job of enforcing those screen time limits. I will tell you there's also, I'm not going to tell you where for reasons you'll understand in a second, but there are communities online that try to tell kids how to get around said limits. So just be aware that, again, we want our kids to understand the purpose for those limits and try to operate within them and not just have our kids get really good at being able to get around some of those limits.
My other question is around protecting against pornography and stuff like that. So, obviously I think the best option is to minimize social media stuff, but are there other apps or things to put on their phone just for preventing that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's multiple ways you can approach this. What I would encourage you to do, depending on your level of technical skill, there's a lot of routers that have some levels of parental controls built in, right? I would encourage you, if you have younger kids, operate on what we would call an allow list. What that means is you're going to enter in a set of websites that your kids can go to, and they can't go to anything else, right? That's better than just a filter, because filters are always going to be, they're not going to be perfect. As your kids get older, you might transition to something else, what we would call a block list or a filter, where that's trying to filter out all the bad content. There's some great routers like Eero, E-E-R-O, for example. They have some parental controls built into their router that you can leverage, but I want you all to understand this other limit. If your kid has a cell phone with a cell phone provider, then they can turn off your home internet and just choose to use the internet on the cell phone. So you have to look at that as well. So that's where if you pair a good router at home that has some parental controls built in, and you pair that with a device like a Bark phone or a Trumi phone that has parental controls built into the phone, that's ultimately how you can kind of manage both things. As a matter of fact, that's what we're doing at our home. Now, because I'm a little bit of a dork when it comes to technology, I've done it in a crazy way on the platforms that we're using, but the same thing is true. Protect the home network, protect the cell phones. You have to do both if your kids are going to have devices that have their own internet connection. Okay, yeah, let's talk about that. So there's two different ways you can use Bark. You can use Bark as if you already have an iPhone or an Android phone, you can get Bark, you can pay for the subscription, you can install it on those devices. That works, but you can have more control if you're using the Bark phone. So for example, things like preventing them from deleting text messages and things that the reason that that doesn't work on normal phones is because the operating system doesn't allow Bark to control that. Here's the other thing I would say. Like if you look at my phone, my son Keegan has it at the moment, but I've got an iPhone, but I'm here to tell you that there are things that Apple does not let developers do when it comes to parental controls. So there's no ability that Bark has this kind of hack way that they try to monitor text messages for iPhones. So I say all that to say, if you're not super technical, it's easier for you to go with one of the phones that actually has parental controls baked into it than it is to try to take a phone you already have, or you go and buy a phone from Verizon or whatever and try to then install parental controls on it. There's going to be some more gaps with that kind of parental controls versus the phones that are made with that content built into it. So
Okay, I know we're short on time, but just quickly, our oldest got on Instagram when she turned 16. So I got on Instagram. Don't know what I'm doing.
Yes.
But are there studies that show with teenagers or children knowing that if they're on social media, that their parents have access to their account, that have their login information, et cetera, that changes things? I'm curious if that's part of the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. But here's the thing I would say, right? And this is a part of the discipleship conversation with your kids, is teaching them, yes, I'm going to be monitoring what you're doing because I love you, because I care about you. I want to keep you away from some danger, and there might be some things I point out that, hey, you need to do differently on your post moving forward. The problem is at times if it's just, hey, I'm going to monitor your stuff, one of the challenges is, and this has become a trend for a lot of young people, is they basically have their accounts they use that their parents can see, and then they create a bunch of fake accounts that they'll go in and use, and that's where they really interact with other people. And so we want to teach our kids, again, to live within the boundaries we give and not just have them get really good at kind of operating around those boundaries. And that's part of where, as a parent, we just have to know their heart, and we really have to push into that and see what we can do to, again, encourage them to be obedient to their parents and follow after what Christ has called us to do.
Okay, I don't want Pastor Aaron to have the last word, so is there one more question?
Hey, I have two boys that fall in the group of where it recommends 45 minutes a day for recreational use. Say if they don't use it for several days, what are your thoughts on, like, can they build that time up where they could use it on a Friday, Saturday, or is it just once that day's over, that's gone?
Yeah, I mean, I think ideally it's once the day's over, that's done. And that's not because, again, we're trying to penalize our kids. It's just because, you know, the data does show that increased exposure does something, right? It does something to the brain. Now, again, one day it's not going to be a big deal. But again, if it becomes a habit where they're having, even if it's just 1 or 2 days a week where they're having extra time, we try to limit it. Now, what we do in our home, and this has actually changed a little bit as our kids have gotten older, but up until recently, you know, for them, we generally didn't do any screen time apart from school during the week. And they could, you know, based on their behavior and school performance, they could use that recreational screen time on the weekends, on Friday and Saturday and Sunday, and they love to do that, right? But we had to really work to be sure even that stayed within the bounds of what they needed to do at that age. So that was a little bit of an effort for us. So I think it is good to kind of make it something that, hey, you're working up towards it and you earn it and you do it. But again, building up just creates an issue where we're also teaching our kids that, hey, this is the way you cope with life, right? Is through having a lot of screen time. And I think the more we can do to just help say, like, listen, yeah, here's your time. Enjoy it. Have fun with it. There's nothing wrong with it. But know that once you hit this limit, let's go explore the non-digital things in life that unfortunately a lot of people, you know, their age aren't doing.
One more.
Okay.
How would you suggest to navigate, kind of like what Chris was talking about with having Bark and having, I have limits. I have 3 teenage daughters, well, 2 it's still in the house. Balancing checking on the stuff, but then also trusting them. Yeah. Because I know it's a matter of the heart, but if I'm having these conversations, they know that everything I'm doing is because I feel that the Lord is, you know, leading me to protect them, leading me to be wise with them, but then going, but I really just don't trust you, so I need to check your phone now. Even though I have all these limits on it, I just don't trust you enough. You need to turn in your phone, and I need to go through and read your text messages, and I need to look at your social media account, and it's just hard for me to navigate that part of it.
I understand, and I empathize with you on that, but here's some of what I would say again. Like, we wouldn't, you know, if you had a kid, and that particular kid, like, let's just say, you know, you knew you had, you know, a bunch of firearms sitting around the house, and they'd never had an opportunity to go through any type of gun safety course, right? And your kid said, well, why don't you trust me? It's like, well, okay, sure, I trust you, but this is such a dangerous situation that I believe I need to be proactive in keeping you from harm, right? And here's the truth. Your child is much more likely to be harmed by social media and online platforms than they are firearms. And because of that, I think we need to teach our kids that it's not a conversation just about trust. It's a conversation about discipleship, right? I'm going to be training you to eventually be an adult who manages this on your own. But for a long time, we're going to be walking through this together until there's a point when, again, ultimately you're going to own this. And the hard thing is I can't give you any clear ages to say, okay, when your child gets to this age, you can stop doing the daily checks and switch to a monthly check. There's not that kind of formulaic way to do it. But it does come with knowing your child. But again, I would say, again, depending on the age of your daughters that you're dealing with here, I would say, yeah, I mean, this is going to need to be something that you're doing on a regular basis. And part of that is also just a level of accountability that you're having with them. And again, if it were something that weren't dangerous, that'd be another topic altogether. And so maybe some of it is sharing some of the stories that we've talked about tonight with them. And we've actually found that's been helpful for a lot of families, just to help them understand, like, listen, this isn't just me wanting to go in and look at your text messages and trying to invade your private life. It's the fact of there are a lot of people who are just as smart as you who went through this and didn't come out good in the end, right? So we're going to take some time and we're going to monitor it. And just like our discipleship conversations with our kids, it's not like I say, oh, I trust Keegan, so I'm not going to walk beside him on, some of these issues that are going to be challenging for any, young boy who's 16. It's no, we're going to come alongside, and that's going to look pretty hands-on for a while, in the hopes that, again, by the time Keegan's, 18, 19, 20 and out there, he's managing that on his own and he's thriving. So, again, I just think some of this concept around privacy and trust, and it goes back to our culture's obsession with, hey, I want to do what I want to do. I don't want there to be any level of oversight. And I think we can help our kids by kind of breaking them of some of that when possible.
All right. I know there's more questions out there that you haven't asked, but David's going to hang around. He also has his books here right underneath the sound booth with Keegan. And I also want to promote, starting this Wednesday, 3 days from now, we will start the Digital Parenting Fundamentals class. It's a 10-week class. If you can't commit to the full 10 weeks, that's fine. I think just that would be great if you can, but there are certain pieces in there that if you just are able to make certain times, I think that would be great. I'll be leading that class. I have 2 daughters, four grandchildren from 3 years old to 6 months old. My daughters, he was talking kind of about the wave in the early 2000s where everything started happening. They were just a little bit ahead of that wave, and then middle school and high school, it hit like a tsunami. I mean, they were right in the middle of it. So I have a little bit of experience with that. We have already talked with them about our grandchildren and how they're going to deal with screen time with them. So I don't have the technical expertise that David has, so ask him questions like that maybe afterwards. But I think as we get a community together in a small group that's concerned and sees the potential harm, that we can support one another. That's what we do as a body, right? So I'd love to see you Wednesday night. The books are here. I think that's it. If you have any questions, get with David. Afterwards, he's going to stay a little while. Let me pray for us, and we'll be dismissed. Father, one verse that just came to mind as we just walked through this is from 2 Timothy, that you have not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and sound mind. And Father, we need all of those as parents, as grandparents, as teachers, as we deal with our culture, specifically the digital culture that we're all immersed in right now. We need your power. We need your love and your grace, and we need a renewed, sound mind to be able to discern the harm and protect those that we love. So, Father, would you give us that? Would you give us that power and that love and that sound mind, and just keep pouring into us as a church, as a body, as individuals, as parents, as grandparents, as we learn to navigate our culture, especially digitally. Father, I thank you for David. I thank you for his expertise, his passion, his gifts, and his talents that he's giving to the church. I pray that you'll just bless his ministry, and that we all will be able to just kind of propagate that ministry as parents and grandparents and teachers and those that love the next generation. Be with us now, Father. I thank you for a day of worship and of fellowship with our brothers and sisters in Christ. And I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.